Okay, so welcome back to the Art of Environment Storytelling for Video Games here at the Gnomon campus in Hollywood. We hope you're ready for our next presentations by Naughty Dog's Rogelio Olguin and Infinity Ward art director Brian Horton. Remember, we have some cool prizes to give away, which Rogelio is going to take care of at the end of the event, so make sure you stay till the end. If you're joining us online and you missed part one, be sure to check that out. The videos can get a little hidden on live stream, so be sure to look into the event post section to get the complete experience from today's event. If you're tuning in on Facebook to find other videos for this event, you can head to livestream.com/Gnomon, and we have tons more events for you to check out there too. Okay. So let's have a good round of applause for our next speakers, and we'll get started again.
So, hi everybody. My name is Rogelio Olguin, and I'm an environment artist at Naughty Dog. I also do texturing, and today we're going to continue talking about environment storytelling. So, I want to mention the games that I'm really, really proud of, because these ones were exceptional for storytelling. Tomb Raider, The Last of Us, Uncharted 4, and the new one to come soon, The Lost Legacy. That game's going to be amazing, just trust me. Buy it. So, a little intro. So humanity is linked through storytelling. It is a human need to tell stories, so we are able to express what was or what could be. As a kid, we are driven by stories in the simple act of play. And I'm going to tell a little bit of a story that happened when I was in North Carolina and with a friend of mine. He came up to my house and he knocked the door and said, "It's like, okay, I want to show you something that I found pretty cool in past like a forest area." And as we were walking through the forested path, he started describing about that he saw fairies. I was kind of young at that time, right, by the way, and we were really adventurous, so we're not high. Maybe. So in general, we went there, and he was describing this kind of environment to me, creating a story before I even saw it. And as we got there, the forest started clearing, and then we saw, I saw this kind of gnarly looking tree. And that tree, he described it as a tree of life that has been cursed. And then I also noticed the pond that he was talking about with the fairies. He described that you couldn't see the fairies because they were moving so fast, but right next to the pond there was this shack. And he said that, I asked him, like, "Oh, we should go inside, check it out." And he said, "No, when I was here last time I saw a creature in there, and it really scared him, so we shouldn't really get close to that." He's probably doing it for safety or whatever. So yeah, something pondish like that. I mean, it's insignificant, but as kids we're building, a story around it, just playing around. And as kids do, we decided that we were going to be the protectors of this area, and we made staffs. I was the staff of Earth, and he was the staff of all weather. And we would hang out here, play around, try to find other, areas and sections that were interesting. I mean, honestly, if we would have gotten lost and if we would have, died out there, nobody would have found us. We would be on the news. There would be a little picture of Rogelio and Matt there, my friend, and yeah, they wouldn't have found us. We went through sewers. We stayed in sewers, just playing around. We were like, that was our headquarters. I don't know, crazy stuff. We did have games, but this was also what we did. And so it's kind of obvious, the things that we would do as kids, because we would see movies like this, a never-ending story, and the crystal, the labyrinth. And just looking at all this amazing texture work in there and all this storytelling involved. But also, it kind of, as a young age, it kind of opened up this idea of like set dressing and the stuff, to make these movies. So I quickly started to learn about kind of like sets and films and what people would do. I could draw when I was a kid, and this was inspiring when I was a kid to see what other people, can do with their, eventual art career. And, there's a lot of stories involved with making these kind of sets. So, of course, we're back to reference images as being a very valuable piece of the puzzle. So reference images are used heavily. Concept, while provides the main compositional shots and main story elements, sometimes are not detailed enough to provide the intimate details like the feel and look of textures and or secondary events, which environment artists love to put in, which make up a large portion of the environment creation. So looking at this image of a flooded event, you can grab, very quickly some general stories. Obviously, it's flooded. Secondary stories that are in there is like you have that shack that fell through, and it has debris coming from it. But the water, you can also kind of deduce that the water wasn't all that quick or all that rapid. This shack was probably not very well built. The car is still kind of fine. Even the fence was kind of fine. So whoever built this shack didn't build it correctly. And you can also tell without even seeing, you can't really see the ground here because the water's so murky. But you can tell the depth just by natural things because, for example, the doorknob is above water. So as a player, if I'm entering a space, I wouldn't necessarily be scared of jumping into this water. I would know that it's at least 3 to 4 feet, especially also with the car and the fence giving the same reference. But let's say it's been a couple days and I never saw this event happen, right? And we go into one of these buildings. Outside, maybe it looks a little wet, maybe there's debris, it's a zombie world, apocalypse, etc., whatever it is. But I go into these houses and I see something like this. So this is when you can really see that, okay, outside it didn't really tell me about a flood. Maybe it was something else, a tornado or just general debris or abandonment. But in this case, it's telling me more of a story like with the water level on the walls and on the furniture. It can tell me quite a bit of what's going on. And also it tells me that the water kind of didn't go too fast. I've checked out other reference and you can see that there's more like splattering of the water. In this case, it kind of filled up, kind of like just a bin of water pretty evenly. The major items, the bigger items like the bigger furniture stayed in place while the smaller items moved. And so this could be a good way to kind of tell a story in an environment that's just like, just by these small details, you can grasp that there was a flood. And again, if we were to go forward in time, there could have been a case of this, where there's water damage on both images. Clearly, there was something involved with water. One, they're restoring the house with the machinery, and you can see a little bit of moisture. And the other one, you can clearly see the water level kind of grind from it, but also the black mold and cracking of the wall. And so these are two different events, but they all came from one kind of thing, which was the water damage. It all had a process, and through that process, as environment artists, we want to express what happened before and what could happen also in the future. So obviously, there's abandoned interior industrial building. There's a lot of stuff going on here. There's moss, there's dirt, there's all these kind of paints, layers that are happening. Grounding. Everything is being grounded here by all the damage that has happened throughout time, throughout the weathering, dust coming in. Even you can see in the far left, you can see some plants starting to creep in. And especially if you look at the window sills, you can see that that's where you're having most of the paint drips and damage happening, and the rest is kind of still staying in there. As a modeler, this would probably be rather pretty easy. I mean, there would be some parts where you have to kind of tweak them around, but it's a very instanced environment, right? But as a texture artist, to get this look, it would take definitely quite a bit of time because there's a lot of history involved. So this just, I took a trip to Japan with my wife last year, and these are just different alleyways, and you can tell really quickly that the alleyways all tell a different story. I mean, cities in general are as vast and as different as the people that live in it. So you have to kind of take that into consideration. So here's also the same shot of one of the alleyways, but this one I'm looking up to beyond the tarps. And one thing that I found curious, and I could be wrong, but one thing that I found curious about this was the old octopus sign up there. Now, the only way I could see that is really if I was looking up. I don't think it's very useful to have a sign that high up in modern times, but all the signs below it already tell what the items are down below. So maybe that was an old sign that was useful maybe 10, 20 years, but it's still left there, and it's clearly not being maintained as well, and there's a lot of rust in the adjacent corrugate and damage in those areas. So who knows, maybe I'm wrong, but maybe those were signs that were used way more in the past, and they're kind of slightly being abandoned. And, like Josh and Brian, I take tons of photography. I've been getting more and more, especially when I've kind of changed routes from being strictly an environment artist to being more of a texture artist. I've been getting more into photography for that field. And basically it's, the human touch is all over here, and also the natural nature, what the growth is happening on these materials, rough materials versus smooth materials, all this dusting involved on it. Another shot with 3 similar paths. You can tell without even looking at the buildings surrounding it what these paths must have been for. And which ones are treated more. So without really saying much of it, you can kind of tell that the one on the far right is probably just a simple path from somewhere in Japan, because these were taken in Japan, but somewhere in just like a sidewalk. Well, the middle one is probably a little bit more structured, and that was in a temple, but it wasn't a really big temple, and it wasn't a very maintained temple. So you see a little bit of growth coming through. And then the one on the left was definitely designed and maintained a lot more, and it was definitely a very epic-looking temple. And important thing about just reference is that with reference you can get so many different little stories that you wouldn't get necessarily with concept or just thinking about things. Sometimes those references just end up being a whole story element in themselves in an entire game or entire section of the game. I would definitely recommend for studios in the future to, in pre-pro, send artists out, fly them to locations that are similar to their environments, and have them take photographs, have them touch this stuff, because that's more important at the end to get that quality, that human touch. But also now with the technology of photo scanning, it takes some technical artists, takes some people who really done scanning, and you can have assets that you can bring home with you and be able to analyze them and process them, even put them in the game if necessary. So obviously, reference breaks down a little bit on the fantastical. So many times in environments artists, you will be in a situation where reference will not be able to help directly, since those areas are not real places. That becomes more difficult, but the key is to still maintain some sense of grounding. I mean, the same thing as like Middle-earth, Lord of the Rings games. There's still a lot of grounding involved, a lot of history. I mean, Tolkien was a historian, so he maintained all that kind of nitty-gritty information of the cultures and the structures and the world that he made, either through Asian qualities, through European qualities, from castles, and dresses and everything. So all that's very important. Obviously, for fantastical stuff, then concept and specific art direction is very helpful. So we're going to go into individual levels. In this case, it's Uncharted 4, A Thief's End, Escape of the Orphanage. So this is kind of like the second level, or the first official kind of like gameplay level or traversable level. But before this, you're in a boat, and the boat ends up falling apart, and you get an explosion, and you black out, right? And basically, you appear in the orphanage as a young Nathan Drake, and you escape with Sam, your brother. So here's kind of a wide view of the orphanage. When I was making this environment and texturing it, it was basically trying to make sure that there was logic between each building. There was the dormitory buildings, there was the main school building or the classes. We had a church. It was either a religious school and a bell tower slash a clock tower, and also a library. And you can jumping around, you can actually see in sections. Looking through the windows, you can see more of that environment. So you can actually see a library at one point. And another point that I wanted to make, since this is a moment where he did have a flashback, and it's an abstraction of the thoughts that Nathan Drake was going through. It is not necessarily the real representation of AKA Boston or something else. It is what the kid remembered, that version of Drake when he got knocked out. So things that it's kind of like when you go back to your hometown, you view it differently, and you might be disappointed. It's not like that anymore, right? Things like that. So that was the case, trying to get an abstraction of this area, kind of I would call it maybe like a Disneyfication of it or something like that, into the whole environment as a whole. I also wanted to play with the idea that this building had a lot of layers of history, and basically with the idea that different technologies existed. They initially had a lot of piping, then it also started introducing vents and AC and all that stuff as time went on. So it's a little kind of spotty technology-wise throughout the time. This is the first dormitory room where Nathan Drake stays. This is actually a room that almost 60-70% of the people never saw, because you're actually just pointing, when you finish a cinematic with the nun, you're pointing directly at the window, and the prompt tells you to jump out the window. And because of that, most people didn't see it, but there's tons of little details like comic books, there's baseball cards, and in the case for Drake, on Drake's side, he has all these little adventure magazines and books, history books, and things that you can kind of just look at and be like, okay, well, yeah, Nathan Drake eventually did go to El Dorado because there's a Mayan book there. And then you traverse through for a section, the rooftops, and then you get into this doctor's office. Instantly, when you jumped in, I wanted to make sure that the player got the idea as fast as possible. So you would see a lot of this kind of classical doctor furniture. But also one of the things that I wanted to kind of lay in there was that this furniture was either like secondhand furniture, because it's not from the times. It's kind of like this older furniture from like the 70s, somewhere around there. And it's been dinged up, and used and reused. And the orphanage, they probably don't have the money for the brand new equipment. So making sure that that's part of the story. The old doctor bag there that's on top of a filer. And one thing that's interesting to note is the dust on a lamp. A lot of people don't tend to dust their lamps for some reason. So I just put it in there. So interpretation. The idea of adding environment storytelling is mostly going to be interpreted by the player. It can be unintended interpretation. Unintended interpretations can be okay. It is still adding to the player experience. And what I mean is that it's grabbing your attention. It's keeping you in the game. It's keeping you in the story in some way or form. And some of these smaller stories don't really completely matter to the bigger whole, as long as it's maintaining your attention. So the freedom of interpretation and connecting the dots happen through the player's own way of seeing the world. Just like all the conversations we've had, from Josh talking, Brian talking, you're all getting different ideas in your head about what we're talking about. So you're interpreting this very differently, each one of you. But there are, it is up to the designer or the artist, or really the writer and directors to make sure that the important story-driven moments are interpreted correctly. So this was just a hallway with a bunch of orphanage photos. So you can kind of grab a little bit of information. Like there's been quite a bit of orphans that went through this. Maybe the building is not exactly the same, so maybe the building has been rebuilt. It used to be a lot smaller in its heyday. Then it became bigger and bigger as time went on. And perhaps some important people of the orphanage are there in the photographs as well, with the nun and padre and etc. up there. And there's the playroom for the orphanage. And there's tons of little stories in here. I'm just going to mention a few of them. But here's one thing that kind of ties in the time frame of where you're playing. So with the computer, it's the only thing that's kind of like current tech for this area, or it's just a couple of years away. So maybe it's the late 70s, early 80s. You can kind of get that by this. We didn't want to be like dead on exact of what time was when you were playing as Nathan Drake, but that was kind of the one indicator of kind of the timeline. And this one was an interesting one because initially I didn't know what to put on this wall. And so I talked to my art director, and we decided that it would be like get the drawings of kids from Naughty Dog. So he sent emails from all the people in Naughty Dog, and some contributed, and we were able to put this up. So imagine being a kid and having your piece in one of the most famous games, right? It's pretty awesome. And connecting the dots, the same project that was given, and you see the completion of the project over there. It's on the board as well with the little dreams, and the little picture of the house with the sun from the nun. And then you have the alphabet down below. It's a full alphabet with the exception, there's one letter missing. I don't know why I did this. This has nothing to do with the story, but it has one letter missing. And once the nun leaves, you can actually find it somewhere in the environment. My idea with that is that, kids are kids. They're gonna mess around with the nuns, just for the hell of it, So going out to Avery's mansion. This is much later in the game, entering Avery's mansion, the main pirate ruler of Libertalia. Libertalia was meant to be a haven for pirates. The rulers became greedy. And a lot of credits, as you see, in that area. So, main iconic building of the area. You can see this from very, very far away. There's tons of other big structures, and there's definitely a landmark. It's also the building that looks ridiculously gaudy. I mean, it's full of gold. The material is like probably some kind of finer, stone. And that way it maintained this kind of splendor, even being overgrown. And near one of the towers, there's these cannons. So we can kind of assume in this part that they were using these cannons to protect themselves from the invading people. But I like to think that they also, the people that went here to attack Avery, used these cannons against him at one point, because right next to this, where I'll show a kitchen area where the servant quarters were, there's a big wall, like a foundation wall, and that wall is entirely demolished. And that wouldn't really happen by just nature. That might happen by actually somebody, blasting through. So there's one part with an intended interpretation, and John Sweeney, the concept artist on this area, put this together. I modeled it, of course, based on his concept, but the idea is that the grand piano came from the above room, which is the musical room. And basically, that juxtaposition of having, the rich on the top and the poor on the bottom kind of idea. And this was an intended interpretation. It doesn't really matter if you grabbed it completely, but it's an interesting idea that could add to the story. Of course, you come up to this area, and it's just beautiful, full of gold, full of trimmings, velvet, curtains, basically everything you would need to have a good time. This was definitely a place where Avery's guests would be and lounge and have fun, drink, dance, and hear music. You have other instruments there, and the hole where the baby grand piano fell through. And there's just connecting the dots. And imagine if you're down there toiling, you're down there working for these masters, and they're just having fun. I mean, that's going to add stress to your level. So there's kind of a story element that fits the general bigger story of how this area came down to be. So Madagascar City chase, and this is a huge section. Initially, we started the section with Zachary Oliver. He was modeling it, I was texturing it, but eventually it was so big that basically the entire Uncharted team came to work on it, because it was ridiculously long and big and complicated to do, as we tend to do at Naughty Dog sometimes. The area I'm showing is Brian and Jacob Norris, also Zachary Oliver, worked on this section. And there's some reference. You'll see that little green building later on. I'm just noting that, but basically, yeah, we took a lot of reference. We had videos, we have also links to written information for architectural stuff, and all that stuff helped to create kind of the connection of this area. Of course, we stylize it, just like Naughty Dog, because there's a city of Antananarivo in Madagascar, but in Madagascar, in Uncharted, we don't name it a name. We kind of made up our own city based on these looks. The middle one is the staircase market. That was pretty much directly grabbed from this photo. We decided that we're going to make a market going down these stairs, and you're going to destroy all these little markets. So all their life, of collecting and having, to sell this stuff, their life living of these people was destroyed by Nathan Drake. So here we had little vignettes. There's starting for the images of the level. Little vignettes, quick reads, and ideas of people working. So you had the repair shop with a car, slightly older car. Environment in general is worn down. Maybe at one time this city looked really nice, but I'm not sure what the economics are of that city, but eventually a lot of these buildings kind of started getting degraded over time, and it started to become patchy with corrugate, with repainting and all that kind of stuff. So all that stuff is kind of inlaid into a lot of these buildings, and making sure that each section as you go feels a little bit different, kind of like this back lot. It has bricks on the floor, it has tires. If I was able to swing the camera, you would see an old car with no tires, and some abandoned buildings. And this is actually one of the buildings that we directly took from reference. We just sent the reference photo, and we told outsourcing, make it. And they made it. And then we got it back and textured it. And you can go multiple routes here, but one thing is that's really cool in the game is that you can actually pile through this section that has a lot of laundry, and the laundry will stick to the car as you're rolling, and then eventually kind of fall off. More buildings kind of describe the look, very, dusty, damaged through time, leaking, all that kind of stuff in the materials. And there's that little green building shop. And even the steps were taken kind of directly from the reference. And there's the part where Nathan Drake's piles right through. And again, keeping with the idea that there's little vignettes, because you're really just flying through the space. There's little vignettes of little stores. They're not highly detailed. They're enough to tell a quick story. Okay, that part had clothing, and down below there's another one that has like carpets, and all throughout the middle it's just like general fruits and vegetables, that kind of thing. On the texture side, maintain with the idea that everything's slightly worn, slightly, askew and dirty. We have blends for this corrugate that we can make it rusty, we can make it broken, we can make it like it's been rusted so much that it actually starts making holes in it and stuff like that. And then the cobblestone that has all these kind of like little bubble gum bits, or things that, like little fruits that fall from the tree, they create these kind of like really shiny, sticky little things that was described on the texture there. So we also did a Madagascar City multiplayer. And on this one, it was really a benchmark to hit 60 frames per second. But my aim, obviously, as an artist, was also to make a multiplayer interesting, give it a story, give it places. Because as you're playing, you want to know where you're at all the time. So if you played this level, there's a center area of the level, and it has several shops. Every shop is different. You have the butchery, you have the general store, and you have this clothing shop in here, and plus other shops right behind you. And this, on the main road of the multiplayer level, they have a greenhouse section. Again, when initially I'm given the design for all this stuff, the designer doesn't necessarily say, this is going to be the greenhouse. No, this is literally just a block. So we get to decide kind of, with art direction and with storytelling to figure out what this area will be, and this ended up being a greenhouse. And it's good because you can see the greenhouse from a distance. It's very green. And the major story from this road section is that after the event from the single player, Nathan Drake plowing through everything, you never saw police in the single player, right? So this is the only time you actually see a police car. They actually came around and tried to check it out and be like, who are these crazy guys destroying our city? And there's actually an APC truck in the back somewhere that's from Shoreline. Shoreline is the enemies of Drake in the game. And you have a little restaurant and, of course, iconic things. You can see that tower in the distance all throughout the level. And on the opposite end, you have this area of construction zone. Again, the designer, when initially designed this, had no idea what it would be. Initially, we thought it was going to be a destroyed kind of like buildings, but I came up with the idea that they were, starting to expand and construct buildings here, and also adding this shantytown area. If you look if you were to turn around into other areas, you can actually see that they are starting to demolish the shantytown and take over that section and basically push out the poor by doing construction for, whoever needs it. So it's kind of bigger social story there. And then in Last of Us, moving on to a different game, going to the suburbs riverbed. And here, basically, what I wanted to get from the get-go is everything in the environment, especially because it's all naturalistic, everything in the environment feels like it's weighted. There's been erosion. There's been, it all makes sense to the world. And I had tons of reference for this kind of stuff. But basically, just looking at the ground textures here, where it was closer to where plants were, you would get, little twigs, little leaves and stuff blended into the area with where all these plants were. As you went down closer to the river, you would get less of that and more kind of a muddy, sandy material. And this was actually an inlet from the ocean, so that's why there's kind of a sandy material. So here's, you can see above from the direction of looking at here, you can see the kind of the erosion effects that were happening to the sand and the dirt in there, and it has specific directions of either the water coming in and bringing it out again, all that kind of history of what happened naturally. Of course, the cliff sides and everything all making sense, the rock deposits, where the grass would grow, and all that kind of stuff, making sure that it made some kind of logical sense. This is kind of one of the only structures that's like, hard surface, human-made structure, the boat. And the little story here is that, yes, somebody could have been in the cabin and was either staying there for a while, or who knows, maybe the person still lives there and you just happen to come in and steal their stuff while they're not there. Down in the back of the boat, I actually did add another little story element. Can't really see it here, but it has a bucket, a seat, and a fishing pole. So basically telling the story, well, maybe somebody comes fishing here occasionally. And later you end up going into the sewers and you end up kind of knowing what happened to the people around this area. Some textures and materials that I did in ZBrush, and actually, I finished them in Photoshop. There was no substance. Well, there was substance, but I didn't know about it at the time. And it wasn't as good as it is now. But basically, yeah, the idea for these textures is to get that physical gravity of all the material and dirt kind of falling off and creating this erosion effect. One way that I found that was interesting when I was sculpting is using the brush with gravity. And I was able to sculpt this kind of sense of gravity using the brush, usually used for folds on characters and stuff like that. On The Last of Us, the prologue, I worked on mostly textures and materials on this section with Adrian Castro and Vivian Ding for lighting. Our aim was definitely clear reads. This was the starting section, and we wanted to make sure that at all times you knew kind of where the path was, because there's a lot of chaos going around. There's people falling down, people burning, people explosions from coming from the Texan gas station right there, and buildings burning right there. You have people coming out. There's people jumping out of the windows from shops. And yeah, there's tons of all hell broke loose moment, right? But we made sure that it was maintained, it was clean enough so you can read what was going on at all times. The buildings themselves and this kind of environment that you see on the left, one important thing to note is that almost this entire section was built from a Google Maps reference. We actually found a city in Texas that had this small, like, historic town, and a lot of these buildings are directly referenced from that Texan town. We actually had an environment artist who's from Texas to look at it and be like, does this feel like Texas? And he was like, yeah, this feels like Texas. Even with that writing on the floor, if you see that parking writing on the floor, that doesn't really happen in other places besides that small town in Texas. So it's little details like that, that make it believable. Even the outskirts, we made sure that the terrain was kind of in an area where it would make sense, and we found something similar around the area in Texas as well that looked like that, and the bridge style and everything. So we started with the idea of play as storytelling being an important part of humanity. By being active in a game, we come to enjoy it more when we are participants of exploration and the interpretation of the environment, instead of everything being served to us. I mean, sometimes you just have to let the player be and understand that there's a little bit that we're asking from them. You can't just make it completely easy for them to interpret. Of course, too much clarity can lead to boredom, and too little clarity can lead to pure frustration in games. So I'm just going to close this with an environment I did, a personal project. And initially, I started with the idea this was going to be just a subway station, pretty ratty and all the grime and everything. And towards the end, when finishing it, it really didn't have any kind of real story besides it's just a subway station. So I added the Black Mesa logo, and then I started doing this creature in the back, and it kind of completed the scene. So just doing a small little thing like that will make a scene pop up, and this actually, it was actually kind of like a self-test. With this environment was, I was kind of playing around with the idea. Let's see what happens if I release this and people see it. How are people going to react? And of course, Half-Life 3 being a big thing that people want to play, I kind of used that for my advantage, and people loved it. It's one of the simplest projects I've ever created that has gotten the most attention, weirdly enough. One other thing is that, it's just add stories to your environments. Just go there. It doesn't have to be perfect, but it's definitely going to be much better than just not saying anything at all. And that's one thing that it seems a lot of newer environment artists kind of, honestly, they fail at is not adding those story elements. It doesn't have to be perfect art. Some of these textures and how they're UV'd, they're pretty horrible in my opinion. But adding a little bit of story in there just makes it pop out. And it'll definitely, if you're in a situation where you're applying for a job, those kind of elements are the things that are going to catch people's attention. So, thank you very much. By the way, that's my dog. He's 2 years old today, actually.
Aww. You did the dog thing at the end, man.
I had to.
Well, I had the good fortune of working with Rogelio on Tomb Raider. My name's Brian Horton. I'm currently creative director at Infinity Ward. I was the studio art director before that on Infinite Warfare. I've worked at a number of companies, and my whole career, my focus has been characters and worlds. That is, to me, the most, it's the essence of storytelling, it's the essence of creativity to me, is if you can create characters and worlds that people are compelled by, they're going to be invested in the content that you make. So let me start my presentation here. Why am I missing this here? Help me, Rogelio. Full screen. Trying to get there. Slideshow from beginning. All right. So environmental storytelling. Once again, quick summary. This is my 22nd year in the games industry. I absolutely love it. It's my passion. It's not something I expected to do. I went to Savannah College of Art and Design to study illustration and painting. I'm a true believer in foundation arts as if you have a good education in foundations, it will help you in anything that you do in art. So I always come back to those core lessons I've learned about color theory, about composition, about characterization, and telling a story. Ultimately, everything about illustration that I learned was in one image you have to tell a story, you have to convey something, an idea. And it's a terrible cliche, but one image can tell an amazing story. It's worth more than 1,000 words. So with that said, I'm going to go a little bit into this presentation. I am not going to be focusing much on my work at Infinity Ward, but I will talk a lot about Tomb Raider. It's a project that I worked on. I worked on the first Tomb Raider as an art director, and I worked on Rise of the Tomb Raider as a game director. And the thing that's amazing about this franchise, and the franchises that, with Naughty Dog, when you're talking about Uncharted or Tomb Raider, these are games where your world is your probably most important character next to the protagonist. So when you bring your world to life, it really is a character in and of itself. So I'm going to talk a little bit about how I've constructed the talk today. And the first topic I'll talk about is narrative themes. Then I'm going to talk a little bit about lessons from film, the psychology of color, layers of history, you've heard that term a couple times today, landmarks, symbolism, and visual language. As I'm moving from art direction to creative direction, I really believe it's important to think about your theme. I'll start the topic today and saying, well, what is environment storytelling, at least as I see it? Environment storytelling should express the narrative organically without exposition. So you should be able to go to your environment, explore it, and you'll start to understand a little bit about the history, what happened there, what it was and what it is now. And it's a very powerful tool because you don't need to have a character say a word and you can sort of instantly understand what is going on. So it's extremely important. And as an artist, every decision you make to describe your environment should be driven by intent. Nothing is put there by accident or on, you sort of, I need to get chairs in there. I'm just going to put chairs. Like, well, why are there chairs in there? Why are there roots busting through this wall? You have to ask yourself the question at all times, what is the intent of the thing I'm doing as an artist? What story am I trying to tell? And the best stories are supported by a universal theme, understood by all cultures. I really believe our medium as visual artists is universal. We communicate across cultures, across languages, and that's what makes us so powerful as storytellers, is because we're not bound by a single language. So, narrative themes. Themes should be universal truth that drives the narrative and informs the environmental storytelling. So here's some themes that you're going to see in classic literature and films, and I often go back to painting. Since I am in art school, I studied painting. It was sort of the foundation of my learning in the visual arts. I think sometimes paintings capture these themes the best. So honor is a theme. Freedom, liberty, love, injustice, vengeance, guilt, survival. And survival is very important. It's something that was informed Tomb Raider. It informed The Last of Us. It's a theme that is extremely potent because it really goes to the core of humanity. And one of my favorite films is Children of Men by Alfonso Cuarón. And the reason I love this film so much is because it is truly a study, a warning in a way about who we are as a people. But yet even in the worst of times, when you have a theme of despair, which Children of Men does, this is a culture who has no longer the ability to reproduce. So there is nothing but death on the horizon. You still can have hope. And that's what I love about this film. So we start off with a scene. The first scene in this film is the most mundane thing you can think of. It's a coffee house. How many people here have gone to a coffee house? Come on, there's got to be more people that have gone and gotten coffee here. It's extremely mundane, and that's what I love about this opening shot, is because it's mundane and it sets us up in a world that we can recognize. It's something that seems extremely topical, but yet people are transfixed to this news story. And our protagonists are sort of wading through the sea of people transfixed to this news story, and he really can't have a care about what's going on. And what we find out is the youngest person in the world has died. And what does that mean? It just means that this is the beginning. It's another reminder that the society is dying. Like there's no more hope. If the youngest person in the world is dead, what could that mean for us? And it just puts people in a sense of despair. And when we go outside of the coffee house, we see London. We've established London. And it's a London that we can sort of recognize. And this film is from 2006. Some of these things that were very futuristic are now coming to pass. Large-scale video displays. There's a sign that says, "Please report suspicious activity." So there's this sort of heightened state of alert. And even though things look futuristic, everything looks a little run down. It looks a little decayed. So while it's futuristic, it's not gleaming. It doesn't feel hopeful. As our protagonist sort of settles to put his coffee in and put a little alcohol in his coffee, we also notice some things in the background if you pay attention. You can see these garbage bags sort of collected on the side. Those garbage bags tell a story. They say garbage collection isn't even happen on a regular basis. In London, this wouldn't happen today. This is not something that is normal. But this is a society that's under decay. It's crumbling. And of course, this event happens, this dramatic event that breaks the normalcy of the scene. And you have this vicious terrorist attack that flips the level. So the environment behind us, even though our protagonist is in the foreground, the background instantly takes command and sets us into the stage of what this story is all about. So in the first few minutes of this film, I was just transfixed. I was sucked in because it told me a story without any exposition for my protagonist. There's the news story going on in the background that sort of gave me some context, and I was just like, what is this going to be all about? All I know is I'm hooked, I'm connected. So as we follow our protagonist, we can see, this is a classic shot. This is your character in the focus. But what I love about the direction of this film is that you often leave the protagonist and you'll focus on the background. And this is, there's many, many moments like this throughout the film where there's a ton of attention put to what's going on in the background. So avoiding fertility tests is a crime. Wow, that's saying something about what this society is all about. And then you'll follow the protagonist, and just as you're doing a tracking shot, you'll see this graffiti in the background. It says The Human Project. Well, what is The Human Project? We don't know at this time what The Human Project is, but they've laid a seed in our brain about what The Human Project is, and this is all before we know about it. And what it is it's the one beacon of hope in this society. They believe they could solve this infertility problem, but it's almost like a myth. Like, who's The Human Project? Is it really real? I don't know. But this is something that just happens in the background, and then as we start to learn more about it, it will come forward in the story. But as we go forward, we see something that I feel is just extremely kind of prophetic to now, as we have a massive humanitarian crisis. The UK, London, is one of the last areas within the civilized world that's got law and order and commerce, and it becomes a destination for people to flee into, because life around the world is disintegrating. Civilization is disintegrating. So you have this tremendous tension between the refugees and the population, and you have this police state kind of feel, and people are in cages, and it looks absolutely horrific. And you have other kinds of storytelling in the background. These aren't main stories; these are just secondary stories of this group of people in these yellow cloaks, a very strong color in this composition, with repent clearly labeled on their ponchos and on their signs. And every single sign that's back here has been done so with purpose. There's not a decision in here that's random. It all has a stitch in the fabric of the story. And I love this shot. Very simple shot of our protagonist. But every single one of these newspaper clippings has been made to talk about the history of what's been going on in this society. Chaos in refugee camps. Armageddon begins with Russia detonates nuclear bomb. Kazakhstan annihilated. So even if you never have seen, when you're watching the film for the first time, none of that stuff will probably get into your foreground thoughts, but it's all building into your psyche, and you start to get the feeling of what this world is about. Even when they go into close-ups and they have, you could tell these are kind of old, but you have the storks sort of delivering babies, and then all of a sudden they're all being bombed down, they're being shot down. And even the way this image here is juxtaposed against that, it's like they've almost made it into an action, almost like a comic book panel. All of these things are just so purposefully done. Another thing that's really strong about this movie is its symbolism. And I credit Evan Pushtak, who did this really amazing YouTube video. It says, "Don't ignore the background," about Children of Men. And this is the theme of death and despair. So you see this woman holding this man. It could be her son. It could be someone she knows in the neighborhood. It's not clear, but you just know she's grieving. She's in absolute despair over the death of this person. And that clues into our psyche on things all throughout our history. So La Pieta from Michelangelo from 1498 it's a nod to this image, and it's something that it's burned into our psyche. Whether you're religious or not, this image is probably familiar to you. Guernica from Pablo Picasso from 1937 explores this theme, and they purposely use this in the Arc of Arts, this one location that's very clean and pristine and kind of modern, and it feels like a space that's rich and still and postmodern, but at the same time, you start to see these negative themes, these dark themes framing the characters. So these themes, these images, and this is one called Kosovo Pieta, about a similar idea was an inspiration for that one scene. All of these things sort of build into a tapestry of symbolism for the film. But in all this darkness, you have hope. And the theme of hope comes through in the core essence of this story, which is there is a woman who is pregnant, and that is the hope for the future of the society. So fertility and hope. And that is a reference to Botticelli's Birth of Venus. And then when we see this baby being born in the film, it's not brightly lit, it's not something that you feel good about. It's almost you feel afraid because you have this really harsh light, the way they chose to lighting this baby up amongst all the darkness. It is a beacon of hope, but it's still very fragile and very dangerous. So, it is telling a very clear story. While there's hope, it is fragile. And when you see them going through with the baby, they deliberately use a strong color. This film is very monochromatic in a lot of ways, but you'll have this one strong color of the wrap in there to draw attention to it. And you'll see all the violence. The violence stops around this moment of hope. And I just really love how the construction of this scene, these scenes evolve, and how you start to see humanity, even in its darkest hour, start to rally together. And then you have this sort of ark-like boat at the end, where our main protagonist has sacrificed his life in hope for the future of survival. That's kind of a dark story, but I absolutely love it for its attention to visual storytelling. Another thing from film, as a big Disney fan, as Brian is, color scripts and color is extremely valuable in how you're going to have an emotional impact on your viewer. And I credit Lily Sierra on this. She put this together, and I just thought it was really, really valuable. So I just wanted to show it off in context to this, is that each color that you can choose in your film or your game can have an emotional impact. And sometimes it could be different depending on how you frame it in the world. But pink, has this innocence, sweetness, femininity, playful, empathy, beauty. Blue, you have the cold, isolation, a cerebral, a melancholy, a passivity, and calm. Orange has warmth, sociability, friendliness, happiness. It's exotic, it's youthful. And then for this yellow, depending on how you treat the yellow, it could be madness or it could be idyllic. So it just depends on which shade of yellow you use. But you can see this color is used to good effect to get different emotions from the audience. And then for green, nature, immaturity, corruption, ominous, darkness, anger. These colors are purposeful in films. And with video games, just like in Disney films, they've used color and color scripting as a way to reinforce the emotion that we want the audience to feel. Sound has a big influence on that, but as artists, color is probably the biggest thing we can do. It's intrinsic to us on an emotional level. Now, some cultures view color differently. So, for instance, red. In Asian cultures, red means something completely different than it does to us in the West. But red is an extremely powerful color, and it's been used in film for, some of my favorite films use red in a very powerful way. For love, passion, violence, danger, anger, power. So those are two very conflicting emotions between love and passion and violence and danger. But once again, context has a lot to do with how you interpret those colors. Sixth Sense did color coding extremely well with the use of red. Every time you see red, there's something dangerous is going to happen, something ominous is going to happen. So it sort of, every time you see that color subconsciously, it makes you unnerved. And it's a pattern that they use, M. Night uses very well. The red doorknob. In The Shining, red is used also in an extremely powerful way. And this time, it's, red is in isolation, so it could be, like in this shot here, red is sort of surrounding the character. This shot, the red is just a focal point in the center, but it will always draw attention. So that's a little bit about film, and I recommend, when I think about video games, across my career, I think having a really fantastic knowledge of film and the use, how cinematography and color and composition works through film is very informative to video games. But what's great about video games is it's not a passive media. It's a media that you're supposed to explore, you're supposed to see yourself. And in that way, it gives us another tool to use that films can't, which is the user experience. So I'm going to talk a little bit about Tomb Raider. And one of the things that's important to this franchise as an archaeologist, as Lara Croft is an archaeologist, are layers of history. And this one image here, this is one of our first promotional images for Tomb Raider. We wanted to tell a story, a very clear story about what our version of Lara Croft was. This was a reimagining of the franchise. And we see Lara Croft, besides in her pose, which is very telling, in a moment of survival and struggle, everything around her is reinforcing that theme. The starkness of the scene, everything is sharp angles. There's a convergence. That nothing is straight, and everything is slightly shattered and broken. And that is a purposeful use of storytelling in the environment to suggest the state that the character is going to go through. So these are working on compositional and set dressing details to show. You have a galleon in the background that is one layer of history. You have a bomber from World War II. You have a bucket in the foreground that feels more modern. All of these things are working together to sort of suggest this place is a shore of wreckage across the ages. And so one image can tell a very powerful story. And one thing that we tried to do in Tomb Raider is understand what layers of history we were going to describe. So we wanted to have this ancient Japanese layer of history. And we wanted to use the myths. And Amaterasu and Himeko were myths that we wanted to explore. And we wanted to see not only this mythological culture, but the living culture of a society that would be living at this time. So there is a layer of history of ancient Japanese. We had this sort of 16th century layer of history with the galleons and gold and helmets. And all of these small details were, if not featured in the foreground, they were parts of the artifacts that you can collect, or they were part of the set dressing that we would put into the world. So you felt the fact that ships had been crashing here, people had been crashing here over the ages. And then we had a World War II Japanese layer of history. And of course, there is the modern layer of history, and that's the final layer where our survivors and Lara Croft and this group called the Solari, which were modern sort of survivors, have sort of banded together to create this malevolent enemy that Lara has to face. But myth is also extremely important to the Tomb Raider franchise. And in cultures, the one thing that it's very difficult when you're building a new fantasy, which we do with Tomb Raider, it's not an absolute historical drama. It is a fantasy of historical drama. You have to build on real cultures because cultures are built up of thousands of years of evolution, and it's nearly impossible to put that amount of detail of how pottery is constructed or how sculptures have been evolved or paintings have evolved without having some reference to reality. So we lean very heavily on real reference and cultures to establish this history. In Rise of the Tomb Raider, we had Katesh, which was a Russian myth of the sunken palace. So we had all these images of these beautiful Russian paintings and idyllic ideas of what Katesh was, and we thought, oh, that's so cool to have a sunken palace. What would be under the water? Well, our version of Katesh, it was sunken under an ice layer. So we used a similar idea. We took a myth, but we twisted it. And something I was very passionate about was bringing Byzantine architecture, which is a desert architecture, into Russia. So a lot of what's great about Russian architecture, as I did my historical research, was Russian churches are built off of a Byzantine layer. So we were connecting the Russian history with ancient Byzantine, and that's how we came to the aesthetic for Katesh. Things that often are similar in the franchises that we've been talking about are in the layers of history are the intent of a scene and what it was in its heyday and where it's finally become to after age. The one thing that's really cool about taking contrasts. Is you have a desert location that's devoid of water, and if you add water to it, instantly you can transform the intent of that space. So we had a small oasis in the middle of this desert canyon, and where the water flowed, you could see the growth of the greenery start to grab hold and bringing life to an area that would be otherwise lifeless. Also, visual imagery for storytelling is seen in Tomb Raider through these murals. Very similar to the illustration concept is we wanted to describe the cultures and the people through these murals, and it's something we used in the first Tomb Raider, and we really used it a lot in Rise of the Tomb Raider as well. And it really gives you that sense of culture, and this is all inspired by classical Byzantine renderings of religious figures. We had an artist, Brandon Russell, who absolutely nailed this aesthetic, and he did all of our murals throughout the entire game. This is one of Brent Adams' illustrations. Brent Adams, by the way, I'm going to show a lot of his work. He is the art director at Crystal Dynamics, and I work with him very closely. He is the sort of, he is my brother in arms in creating what the tone and aesthetic of Tomb Raider would be, and the amount of work he did was astounding. But this is one of those scenes where we wanted to tell a story about our prophet, and how there are, let me see if I have an image that can represent this better. I'll have to get to it. But there's a scene where this is the top layer of a shrine where the sarcophagus of the prophet would be, and we want at every layer as you built up got more and more gold inlaid, and we wanted to have this sort of this feeling of tribute at the base of his sarcophagus. People would come there and give their tributes of gold. So that was a big part of the visual storytelling of this particular landmark. Our concept team is absolutely amazing, and I lean on them extremely heavily to create new but grounded expressions of a history. So this prophet was a fictional character, but we wanted him to feel as legitimate as anything you would see plucked out of a history book. So this is this is one of the structures. It's an archive that is in disrepair, and there's like thousands and thousands of scrolls, and this is sort of a center of learning, and we wanted to have almost a Greek-like inspiration. So when I took my trip to Turkey to do inspiration for this, I went to Cappadocia and I went to Ephesus, and Ephesus was a Greek annex in Turkey, and we allowed Greek influence to work with our Byzantine influence, and that was all based on a historical context. This is another one of Brandon Russell's renderings of the murals. And what I love about this is he really put a lot of time and attention into not only what the image was saying, with the prophet flanked by these soldiers, but how the cracks would sort of be arranged and where the wear and tear would be. And this was extremely informative for the artists that worked. They could basically take his work and recreate that in shaders, because he had all of these layers broken out for them to describe it. Some more murals that depict mosaics of the prophet. And then we get a little bit more into the mystical, where there's a map projected onto the ground here, where it tells Lara where she needs to go to find the lost city of Katesh. And going back in time a bit to Tomb Raider, this was one of the first pieces of visual set dressing that we spent time on the project, and there was a lot of time and attention put to it, and it really pushed our themes of sacrifice and the idea of the Queen Himiko. And the use of red and flames was a very deliberate color to try to express the dread and danger that Lara was facing. This is the first thing she experienced as she wakes up from the shipwreck. And as she explores, we'll notice that this sort of cave is built by somebody, some madman who's taken the flotsam that is washed up from the shores and constructed this crazy contraption of sorting garbage. And he used it as a means to the tide would rise and things would flow into his little cave, and then he would sort them and then the things that were important would fall into this net. So he created this little sorting device that would move big objects down and small objects would be caught into this net. And that's just a small little story that we wanted to tell of a puzzle that needed to be created. So I really love that the artist spent a lot of time trying to come up with a story of who this hermit was in the cave. And it was really a fun example of how we created visual storytelling. And he's the same hermit that created this scene here with the sacrifice. And when we emerge out from his den, we do get the reveal of this ship graveyard of all different ages. And it really was something we wanted to have an emotional impact, to let the player know that they weren't going to be leaving anytime soon. This is one of Rogelio's levels. So like I said, this dude right here, I miss him a lot. It's been a while since I've worked with him. But Rogelio, I mean, I know you didn't single-handedly build this, no. But you are one of the major artists on this map, and it was a massive space, and it was a very complex space too, because what we saw from afar, we now had to explore in up close and detailed. So we had to balance our memory for all these different layers of history and have spaces that had a tremendous amount of detail. So it was a really big accomplishment back on the Xbox 360 days to pull this kind of detail off on the scale. But you'll have there's a small ship off in the distance. That's the Endurance. That's the ship that you crashed on, and this is the galleon that you'll explore. In the layers of history, this shows one of our Japanese castles that are sort of augmented with these shantytown structures that were built by the Solari. So this is a good example of these layers of history. Another great illustration from Bren here shows how this flotsam, there's modern furniture and bottles and an old helicopter all in juxtaposition against this Japanese castle. Okay, so in Rise of the Tomb Raider, we had similar goals for this game, but we wanted it to make the scale much larger. So we put a lot of emphasis on the same tenets, the same ideas of juxtaposition and layers of history. And this is a Byzantine church-inspired location in this ice cave. Here's a story that came from Montreal, our sister studio, there was a story that they told of, in fact, this is all backed up with journals, how they were chasing this character into the north, and their ship got stuck in the ice and then went down a waterfall, and it finally froze there and became this sort of treasure trove that the player could explore. I mean, at the time, we're like, man, this is a crazy idea, but when it got in the game, it was really an impactful landmark and a fun place to explore, to see the ship on its side and have navigation on it. Here's another scene here in a layer of history, we have this Russian gulag and these military helicopters sort of encased in ice, and in the background, we have this large castle-like shape. This is when Game of Thrones hit, and we were all super stoked about Game of Thrones. Who wasn't stoked about Game of Thrones? But this was a fun piece by a talented artist who's now working on God of War. This is one of my favorite bits of visual storytelling, and it's a very simple one, but yet it was extremely effective. It was a film projector, but it became a slide projector in the final game. And the player, you didn't have to do this, but the player could go up to the slide projector and just run through the slides just with an interact, and it would change the picture, and you could just see a story evolve of like, oh my gosh, there's these people here in the gulag, and there was something that happened, and there was a revolt, and they unearthed these Byzantine artifacts, and you start to gain this story just by looking through the slides. I thought that was just a really clever piece of environmental storytelling for the player to discover, but they didn't have to do it. Landmarks. This is something I really believe in. It's a big part of a navigation game where you want to be able to see a landmark at different stages. And this is going back to Tomb Raider. The SOS Tower was one of the first big objectives you had as the player. And the first time you see it, it's a very tiny little thing on the top of a mountain. And you feel, at this point in the game, you don't have a lot of skills and you don't have a lot of experience, and it feels extremely daunting. But as we progress, we get closer to this. You see the color, sort of this ominous green. It feels almost oppressive. starts to get colder, but you get, the colors start to lighten up. And then when you climb on top of it, you get this sense of verticality. And then when you get there, we have a sunrise, and we have this moment of hope. So this is probably one of my favorite moments in the game, where we use color and composition to make this landmark, this moment, feel earned. And when you made that SOS call, it really meant something, because you had a journey to get there. And I've heard a lot of people say the same, that this was one of their favorite moments in Tomb Raider, because it did build up across a number of, at least an hour's worth of gameplay. Here's another example of where you see that castle off in the distance from that first hub, and when you look down on it, it feels very, very small. And this is another level that Rogelio worked on, where you get closer to it, and you can see your destination in the distance. Intermediate landmarks like this helicopter were important. And then when you get inside, you get this reward of this lush kind of expression of gold and opulence. And then when you bust out of there, of course, you blow the place to hell. So that's where the word tomb wrecker came from. She's not much of an archaeologist. She kind of wrecks everything. Here's the shot I was talking about from Rise, where that was the gold sarcophagus up at the top. And we wanted to build a progression all the way to the top. And this landmark was an important one. We really spent a lot of time on reveals. So when the player comes into a space, we like to start kind of tight. And when we reveal through this mist of a waterfall, you see this landmark, and it becomes, I want to get up there. How do I get up there? And the way we do that is through composition and through color and lighting. All of those things help make that landmark stand out and encourages the player. And what we try to provide is a sense of wonder of, like, how am I going to get up there? But you start to see visual clues, which I'm going to talk about later, of how the player might try to traverse up to get to that destination. Here's another one from Rise of the Tomb Raider, where we have to get up this old sawmill. And it's a bunch of repetitious wood structures, but the way we drew attention to this one is we put a murder of crows up there. So just that circle of crows around the top just drew your attention through motion. So that was an important addition to just the general sense of composition of this one piece of architecture that stood out against the background. Same thing, using color, using focus, contrast made this focal point read. And even underwater here, we wanted to use portals and frames as a way to guide the player. So this swimming section, even though there wasn't a lot of control, we wanted to make sure the player knew where they needed to go. So lighting and putting this dark veil around the light. Everyone wants to go to the light, so that's something we used as a theme. You probably heard me say that a couple times, Rogelio. Go to the light. Another landmark in the distance. I love vistas. It's probably one of my favorite parts of making a game like Tomb Raider, is that feeling of wonder and scale, and knowing that thing in the background might be something I could explore. It's extremely exciting. Here's another one of the archive. Once again, lighting. We tend to use a lot of the same tricks, but the thing I loved about this was the ominous sort of branches that were coming in from the top in this flooded archive, sort of like strangling around the focal point. Another one. There's another one. Okay, symbolism, and this is symbolism and symbols. We spent a lot of time to try to make sure that the theme for Lara in this first game it was a reboot, and we had to reimagine this character. So for us, this first scene was almost like a symbol. It was a metaphor for her rebirth as a character, and it's a painful one. And she's in this cocoon-like shape, this wrapped sort of cloth, and she has to use her first tool, which is fire, to escape. And when she lands, it's extremely painful. And for us, it was, even if it wasn't in the foreground, it was a metaphor for her birth. It's a very painful thing to be born. And we continued these themes throughout of birth and rebirth and after, and the idea of immortality through the theme of Himiko, soul transference. So the sacrifice, the ritual sacrifice, the imagery of the Sun Queen became something that we kept repeating these motifs throughout our visual language in the game. So we kept using the sun and the mandala as a visual motif. And we'd use murals, once again, as a means to express the story. Same artist at the time, he got much better as he went, but this was the first game expressing the different stages of the resurrection and transference of power of Himiko. And this one here shows a maiden pouring water into a vessel, and that became our metaphor and our symbol for the soul transference. So water became an idea, and we used even though this is a very magical sequence, we wanted to feel very water-like. So that was something we used as symbolism. And in here, we used a reference from films to work into our psyche of Lara in this sort of next stage of her rebirth as a survivor. And you'd seen similar scenes like this in Apocalypse Now and The Descent, two films that I referenced a lot in Tomb Raider. These walls are also great expressions of really trying to tell a detailed story of all the little maps and all the detail that goes into telling. Really, it's a mind map. It's like, this is what Lara's thinking about. So we would use this not only for storytelling purposes, but it was part of our front end. And then visual language. This is sort of one of my last sections. For Tomb Raider, it's very important the player knows what to do at all times. So for us, we had to come up with visual languages and patterns that the player could understand, so they knew how to burn a fire barrier, or a rope coil would be something they could attach to, and different actions could be performed with that visual language. This, they could attach a rope coil and slide down, climb up, winch up an object, and balance beams that you could walk across. So all of these visual languages, like even climbing up ledges, it's important to be able to tell people that these patterns are something you can expect a clear behavior from. Breaking a wall. All of these things became patterns that the player could recognize. And then the ice climb surfaces. Even climbing trees, which was a new behavior for Rise of the Tomb Raider, had similar visual languages, so it was clear in a very dense and realistic environment what I could interact with as a player. Okay, so in summary, environmental storytelling. It's a narrative theme. It's a universal truth shared by all cultures to inspire that visual storytelling. Feature films are a fantastic environmental storytelling reference for games. And color will evoke emotions that will reinforce your visual storytelling goals. Set dressing can express events from the past with layers of history. And landmarks will provide the player a clear destination, and they should be unique and dominate that vista. Myth and symbolism can communicate complex stories or complement or replace cinematics. And visual language can establish patterns in the world that communicate gameplay intent. And here's some credits here of the people that I referenced in the presentation. And that's all I got. All right, so we're going to do the panel from here.
So, yes, so Brian and Josh are going to join the stage now, and then we'll have a round of questions from the audience. We have a few from Twitter as well, sorry. Feedback. Any questions? Yeah? We'll just let the guys get a bit settled. Thank you guys for those talks, that was amazing.
Hi there. I have a quick question. What advice would you give to people with identifying foreground, middle ground, and background to create these really large and beautiful landscapes and environments?
I'm a big believer in atmospheric perspective, and good composition is a big way to separate those three planes. The thing that's, once again, a lesson from Disney is they always would build up a value scale. And a classic one is a dark vignette, a middle ground for your middle ground tone, and then brighter as it gets towards the sky. But there's many different ways to create those levels. But that's a classic that I would use over and over again. Rogelio, do you have anything?
Oh, basically the same idea with like in fog, developing the layers of storytelling, making sure that the things that are required for the attention are easily accessible, and pathing. There's a multitude of ways that you can do that. Honestly, there's sure they can add more to it.
Yeah, go ahead, man.
Oh, I was going to say contrast, like in general, being able to have like a rigid shape next to soft objects or soft, like the Scotland area, rolling slopes versus this rigid construction, the cathedral. I think contrast is a main way to doing it.
Yeah, I think just from a texture perspective, when you have terrain, just being able, like you mentioned, paths to pull the player through. Sometimes, like in the examples I mentioned, it was, like debris on the edge with water puddles, and sometimes it can be just, even if it's not exactly that way, you could brighten up the terrain where you want the player to go because, like value-wise, they notice that, and so they kind of gravitate to that.
Awesome. One more question.
This was touched on briefly, but how can I get some advice or input as to the process of compromising a gray box scene without a concept to flesh it out and make it more of its own without like compromising the flow and like making the ideas mesh with the design?
You want to start?
Oh, well, yeah, it's like an open box, right? You get to fill in the details, like you said. Part of it is using reference, like digging up and finding as many images or concepts, even not to the space or from the game itself, but other concepts from other games, and just filling in ideas that you already have. And I think, it's like a canvas for us. We get to fill that in, but yes, we can't break the edge flow. We can't break handholds. We have to be very mindful of that. And it's a balancing act. It's a constant, until the very end of the project, it's a balancing act. And sometimes we have to go back and start over again. But for the most part, it's, constantly balancing.
Yeah, I mean, in a practical sense, well, in a design, you get first the block mesh, then what I like to call is the art block mesh part of it, where an artist just takes a couple days and just kind of puts it together really fast, gets some quick textures in there, some quick forms, major key points, major landmarks, and make sure that the design is working. And at that point is where you, in theory, it doesn't always work like that, but in theory is where you can have the moment that a design didn't work out with the art. So you have to kind of go back and forth a little bit to get that before it becomes a bigger issue later on when you're actually building the art. In that process of going back with the design and the artist, you start building also modules, pieces that will work, and those are pieces that you can either start sending out to other artists or sending them to outsource, and making lists of the items that you're going to have for story elements that the artists in the studio might not have time to make, so you outsource those pieces, and you start sending out, okay, well, this is the main things that the artists in the studio are going to concentrate on, and you start piecing that together as a team to try to figure out, okay, well, there's a process of how to develop this environment.
Yeah, I would say the one thing to be cautious of is really understand what the designer's intent is for gameplay pathing, and you want to keep that as clean as possible, because a big part of what an artist could do to an environment is make it look very readable or believable, but it won't be as readable or clear. So clarity of path is important. But everything that these guys said, I would just add on top of it. If you have a concept artist, or you can do concept yourself, a quick paint over that describes your floors and your walls and what materials those are going to be, making sure there's a difference between your floors and walls. That's a big thing for us, is the value range and the difference between those two things to create pathing. Those are the core foundations of your work. And then the set dressing detail should just be layers and layers and layers on top. But those fundamental materials should be your first goal, and you can solve a lot through a paint over.
Okay.
Yeah, to add to that, I don't know if you recall back to the space, where it was like in Advanced Warfare, the screenshot that I showed, a couple screenshots. The space originally was like gray box, right? And there was no, like the designer didn't indicate anything. And so when we're moving through the space, like early on it was really boring. So like it was just walls, right? And it was like, well, it's boring, And so I worked with the art director to sell the narrative of like, hey, well, this is this space, people waited here, so we added chairs. And then in order to kind of give some depth to the space, we added like a room in the back. So if you, like it was a multiplayer map, but if it was a lull in the action, you could look into that room and get a sense of like, hey, this is what they did back here. So even though there's walls in the beginning, you can do a lot to add story. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
More questions? Okay, next one here.
Since most of you have worked on projects that have spanned multiple games, multiple console generations, and that sort of thing, how do you determine or can you find opportunities to reuse assets or concept art and that sort of thing, or do you usually find you have to start over whole cloth?
We reuse assets a ton. I mean, even starting from an old asset and then building on it and outsourcing it or polishing up is a good foundation. So, but a lot of the Rogelio could probably fill in more details like how we do it, but the textures, the old style, before PBR, need to be totally redone. But again, having a solid foundation to start from is always good, and I think there's some stuff from Last of Us still in Uncharted 4, if you look carefully enough.
That was actually something that helped a lot on every consecutive project. We keep all the previous assets, and in the blocking stage, I mean, you're not going to put finished art. You're just going to put something quick just to get it in there. So that actually helps grabbing some old assets. It doesn't have to be fully representative of what the end asset will be, or it could be in the case for the previous gen, which was Last of Us. We had some assets that we could use for the cityscape area. What ended up happening is that those were too low res, but we used them in the beginning anyhow, and we used them as placeholders, and those became, send them to outsourcing, let's up the resolution on these kind of thing. We would give them, all the high poly mesh, all that stuff, and it would make our lives easier. So we would continuously use old assets, and makes it, far easier to, as a studio when you're working on consecutive games like that.
Yeah, I mean, if you have the fortune of working on from Tomb Raider to Rise of the Tomb Raider, we would do the same thing. It would be the library first, and then we would just up-res and or replace as needed. But it did give us a big leg up as we're going from one to the next, even though the generation did switch. Ultimately, most of, if not all of our assets were completely reconstructed, but it was a great way to kick things off.
Yeah, in Infinite Warfare, a lot of the library was pulled over from Ghosts, and I worked with Brian a lot actually on updating those textures to make them more PBR friendly, or just update the aesthetic of them to be easier to look at.
Okay, next question. Sorry, the mic stopped.
I have a texturing question. So when you have things like erosion that are directional, but they're on something like a road that's really long, how do you go about texturing that in a way that's still convincing, even though the road has to go maybe even across the whole level?
You want to take that one?
Yeah.
Well, I mean, sure. In that case, for a long road, because we did create a very long road in Madagascar City. It really is just having enough texture artists. We had a ton of texture artists on that project that created their own road textures and blends and material situations where they had puddles, some were destroyed, and it's all about having the breadth of having that team available, but also making sure that every single kind of area and corner had a little bit of a vibe, a different vibe for that area. And it all came through, having different textures, leveraging vertex painting, all that kind of stuff, and many of, blends. We also have one thing that's, if you guys play with Unreal, we have like an AO blend. So everything that the AO hits, we can create dust or like a sandy bit, and we would use that on larger shaders. That way we wouldn't have to paint that on all the time. Everywhere where the AO hits, we would get a little bit of sand or dirt, and it would kind of do a kind of procedural randomization of that pretty easily.
Yeah, I think if you had mentioned something about like slope or directionality, like you could have, like if it's a muddy road, you could have like a mud with some directionality to it, and that could kind of blend in and out, or you could have like what Rogelio mentioned, water puddles kind of blending into the, what is that called? The curb, where the asphalt meets the curb, and that can kind of add some some weight to the scene as well.
Last thing I'd say is just set dressing. I mean, a big part of how you can break up a surface is just really good, simple set dressing tasks that can make the feeling of that space feel different, even though it's using the same core materials.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
I have 2 questions. First one is, how do you manage your reference? Like,
Sorry,
if you mentioned that you take a lot of pictures, and then if you're working in one art, you think like, I remember taking something, but where is it? Like, do you check from the beginning, or do you file by categorizing?
I think for me, when man, that's a good question.
We're artists. We're
Yeah.
not very organized.
No,
Yeah,
we're
I
not
was just-
organized at all.
I was just gonna say that
I have multiple pictures of the same thing.
Yeah, I was just gonna say I don't, and that's kind of bad on me. I'm not very organized. I literally have everything in one folder that I call reference. And I know that at some point, that's so embarrassing. But I know that at some point, like, what I'll do is I take a lot of reference with my phone. And actually I use Google Images, and I'll be like, oh man, I know I took this photo in, I don't know, Phoenix, Arizona, like on a trip back home, and I'm like, man, okay, I know it was there, so then I could narrow it down. But if I can't remember maybe where I took it, or if I didn't take the photo, I'll just scroll through. And oftentimes, like, just by doing that, you'll find an image that you weren't even thinking about, and then you'll find something little in there that you're like, oh, that would be perfect for what I'm working on. So I don't know, they're like happy accidents. I'm not very organized.
I build folders when I need them, so I'll just choose to say at this time I need to have a walls or floors or set dressing. So I'll collect all my references. It'll be a big thing just called reference for a level, and then I'll subfolder. And the only reason I'm that organized is because I've had to work with other people that I have to show stuff to. And that sort of forced me to be more organized. But
Yeah, I mean, the same thing, create folders, try to organize it. I mean, for the city of Antananarivo, since a lot of people were working on it, it wasn't just like 2 people, or for the environment team, we did have to like make folders, structure it, but also kind of vet the look, because there's a lot of reference for Antananarivo. Just put Antananarivo and you'll see you're going to get tons of images. And some of those images are really cool, but it's not the mood or the style that we wanted for our level. So we would have to make sure that the art director would look through them, and some of those were taken out purposely because we didn't want that to kind of give the wrong idea for the artist and have them use this reference pile in a better way.
I also use Pinterest for personal projects, not just for like, getting cooking information but Pinterest is a fantastic way. It's a really good way of tagging. It's true. Yeah. But I also use it for that also.
great for recipes too.
Yes.
But also use Dropbox too. I think keeping all your reference on the cloud. Personal projects, obviously can't do that for.
I'm starting with getting a lot of like puppies and dogs because I have people that like dogs. So yeah.
Okay, thank you. Well, second question is virtual reality. If I understand game industry is moving forward to the virtual reality, how does it make difference for your work? Is that going to be a lot of more time consuming, or are they going to be changing whole structure?
I don't know if it's going to have an impact on the worlds we create, other than the fact that there is going to be different limitations for what works in a VR world versus a classic console or PC environment. There are people right now using VR as a world creation and a set dressing tool that is very much in its infancy. I currently don't. I would prefer to be in a desktop environment, but I'm excited to see how people are using VR in a way to assemble worlds, because what it does is it makes them present in a space that they're set dressing. I've even seen stuff where people are using procedural tools like shoot rocks, and they'll basically let physics create set dressing that way. I've just seen some new stuff coming up that maybe in 5-10 years we might start using VR as a way to to construct environments. I get sick when I go into VR, so I probably won't be one of those people.
See, VR is almost like mobile right now, so the technology, what you can push is not quite there yet, but eventually the same level of quality that we're hitting in AAA games are going to be there. It's like it's still the early stages.
Thank you.
I have like a cinematics question. It's like, what do you guys prefer giving away control to the player during cinematics, or do you, because most of your games, the camera is controlled by the designer, right? But in some of the other games, you see like it's given you the free control, and they control it by the environment of how they're showing the things. So what do you have your input on that? What do you guys think about that?
I think there's a time and place for both, right?
Okay.
There's moments when you want very explicit framing on your protagonist or an environment or something where a traditional camera is exactly language you want that. Half-Life 2 is probably one of my favorite games, and I love the fact that that whole story is told through player-protagonist framing. But that's not always the right answer for all games, especially for third-person action-adventure games. Sometimes it's nice to be able to get really close to those characters. But yeah, I think if you can tell a story during gameplay where you're having low agency, like they do in Naughty Dog, is a lot of their storytelling is done with a friend walking from here to there. That's an extremely powerful tool for a game developer to make your player invested in that story.
Okay, we have a couple more questions back here.
When you're working on AAA projects, how much freedom do you have to tell your own interpretation of the story through the environment?
I often find I have a lot. Like especially with textures, it's more, I get assigned a task to make this type of surface, but oftentimes I'm able to go out and find a lot of reference and try to put my own spin on it or pull little ideas that I really like from it and put it in there. So for me, I find I have a lot.
Yeah, I mean, the same for for Orphanage, for example. I was almost left alone for that level for a long, long time. And it was kind of a cool experience because I was able to almost art direct part of it to a pretty big extent. A lot of the details there are there because I added them and I thought about them. Of course, there's the bigger stories, and those are directed specifically by Eric, for example, at Naughty Dog, or concept art, or written on paper that we have to follow. But in general, for that level specifically, that was one that I was able to explore quite a bit of just personal kind of storytelling events that were happening, and make it how it is.
We're often just giving a box, right? Like you mentioned for the greenhouse.
Yeah.
So we get to fill in a lot of little stories that we want to tell our own, So, but it has to complement, and it can't diverge too far from the big narrative.
Thank you.
Hey, thanks a lot for the wonderful lecture. And my question is, when you are looking for new talents, what do you expect to see in their portfolios and presentation of which skills and qualities would be decision-making for the hire?
I didn't catch all that.
So obviously there are like a lot of, let's say, would you prefer people who would have different varieties of styles they can work in? Would it be technical part? Would it be creative solution to the current problems? So what would ideal candidate be strong in?
When I'm looking for candidates, there's two styles. Sometimes you're looking for a specialist for something very, very unique. Like I need a materials artist like Josh. He's extremely specialized in that and has a very deep understanding about materials. So that's extremely valuable there. But there's other artists like Rogelio. When I knew Rogelio, he was a generalist. He could design, he could sculpt, he could do materials, he could do lighting. And I think having different people with different skill sets, there's sometimes a use for a generalist, sometimes a use for a specialist. Starting off, I've often given advice is find the thing that you're passionate about and get to know it as well as you can. because being a generalist but not getting up to a bar of shipping quality won't get you a job. So would you agree on that, Rogelio?
Yeah, I mean, definitely agree with that. But as an artist, you also want to, explore. Don't get trapped in the idea that somebody tells you, okay, well, or you yourself want to be just an environment artist and focus on modeling. Explore doing a little bit of texture and explore doing a little bit of lighting. Don't get trapped in one thing because, who knows? You might be asked to do a little bit of lighting. You might be asked to be doing a little bit of texturing at one time. But there's definitely a point where you do have to focus. The industry is definitely getting harder. There's very few moments where you can have like one single person do an environment. It's insanely hard and insanely time-consuming to do that. Usually at Naughty Dog, we have specialists. We have a lighter, we have a modeler, and we have a texture artist, and of course effects artists, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So, and each individual person, if you go talk to them, a lighter, for example, we have a lot of lighters that used to be modelers, but they chose to be a lighter at that company because they're really proficient at that part of the process, yeah.
So I think doing personal work too allows you to test the boundaries of what you're comfortable with, what you want to pursue. So yeah, just keeping both professional work, which you want to focus on, but also complementing with your own ideas, your own artistic voice. I think it's a healthy way of balancing it.
Yeah, to add to that, I think, like these guys already mentioned, everything's becoming pretty specialized. So it's hard because I feel like on one hand, I want to see a lot from you as far as like what you can do, but I also want to see really well-developed stuff. So I think, like Brian mentioned, getting something that's to shippable is really important to, like if I'm looking at it, I would want to see if it's a weapon, I want to see like the best weapon you can make, or if it's a dirt texture, the best dirt texture, or if it's like modeling, it may not even need textures on it, but if you just show that you can model really well and do a lot of set dressing really well, I think that's what's important. And don't get hung up on tools. Like just follow the tool that you, I hear about it all the time. Sorry, I get a little frustrated, but it's like, if you do Maya or Max or Moto, like it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter if you use Substance or you do photogrammetry, like the studio's gonna care because of their pipeline, but just do the thing that get the juices flowing and just have fun, you know?
Yeah, I agree with the tools thing. I mean, all of us here have tons of experience working with so many different tools, and you're always going to be presented with a different engine, a different, modeling tool, and new tools that come in. I mean, Houdini is going to become pretty amazing.
Yeah, it's amazing.
I mean, I textured before Substance. I textured before ZBrush, even. I mean, those are the tools that...
I textured when we had 12 colors, dude.
Oh, yeah, there you go. So that's the thing. You don't get hung up on the tools, for sure. Explore, be an artist. That's probably the most important idealistic thing to say.
Can I say one more thing? I know it sounds contrary to all this stuff about art. We're also hiring people. We want the right kind of personality. We want people that are going to be excited about why are you coming to our studio? What do you want to do for us? So have knowledge about the studio you're going to, have interest in that, have played the games, be able to speak intelligently about them, and show passion, because ultimately I hire more, as much on that, or if not more so, than I do on a portfolio. Because you have to have the portfolio to get in the door, but when you get in the door, you have to have the culture fit for that studio.
That's so true.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Any more questions? Okay.
Hey, when you play like video games and stuff, do you find open world games to have more, I guess, a diluted storytelling environment compared to, say, like a linear game, like a singular driven narrative?
Sorry, I missed the first part.
Like when you play open world games, say,
Open
compared to
world,
like
okay.
linear games, do you find the narrative to be, like the environment of the narrative to be like more in quality for a single like linear game compared to open world?
So it depends on the game. Like Fallout tells amazing stories in open world. A lot of open world games are doing amazing things with story, but it comes down to the studio and what their priorities are. But I play both, and I think they should both, done well, both should be telling stories in their environments.
Yeah, I mean, Witcher is a perfect example of amazing, amazing storytelling, and the enormous, God, that studio's crazy. The enormous amount of work put into the cinematics, the dialogue, the systems, and that's not even just talking about the art itself. It's just ridiculous. It's one of those studios that I just don't know how they do it, because they have a crew that's probably maybe slightly bigger than Naughty Dog, but they're still able to do an enormous amount of work. I mean,
it's passion.
It's pure passion.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, yeah.
I know for like having worked on open world games, they're really fun, right? And you kind of already mentioned Fallout and like Witcher, and you have a lot of really cool opportunities when you're going out, and to me, it's more like just the type of game. Like if you like the type of game where you go and explore, then you're going to find random stuff, and that's going to make you feel excited. But if you're playing like a corridor shooter, everything's going to be really detailed within that space, and it's going to kind of be forced upon you. I think it's more, to me, it's more about what you like, what you would want to work on, and what you like to play.
Yeah, both can do the same job, right? Tell a story. Yep. And Horizon Zero Dawn, which I've been watching Linda play a little bit here and there, it's been amazing what they can do procedurally with a small team. So yeah, but the story is all there. That the narrative-driven path is not the same as in Uncharted per se, but it allows you to find your stories in little corners and nooks, and it complements the big narrative again.
Well, it's actually interesting. You talked about the proceduralness of big worlds. That's something that's going to come to be more and more. I mean, in nature, in its essence, is procedural. It's rules. It's, as you go higher, the trees change, height, and all the stuff, the erosion, the grass, the placement of all this stuff. The moss growing on the trees in one direction, the lights hitting, and all that stuff. It's all very procedural. So I definitely see that that's probably going to be the future of a lot of things, and it will look beautiful. It will look, tangible, as handcrafted, and better probably than handcrafted. Unfortunately.
Yeah, I think that is the future. Is you're going to see more of our worlds being grown and created through a math process. But still, what you feed into that, what is the vision that you have for it? What are the things you want to say with that world? That is where the artistry comes. So the thing making part of our job, that's still going to be a big part of our job right now. But just start understanding that thing making is going to change in the next 10 years.
Yeah, it's going to come pretty soon. I mean, same thing. Artistry, very important. That's why we're here. That's what we're going to do. I've been through many technologies. Brian has been through way more technologies than I have. And it's changing constantly. Every year, something different. There's something coming up, and you got to keep up. Out of school, please change your portfolio every 6 months if you're not getting a job. Definitely keep learning. Even at 10, 20 years that we've worked here, right? We're still learning new tools, and we have to keep up.
I think Ghost Recon Wildlands is a good example of the procedural stuff taking effect, right? Like they used Houdini extensively, and then that allowed them to not focus so much time on placing everything, but then they could go in and polish around the areas that were placed and spend more time being artistic rather than just placing stuff in the grunt work. Yeah. So I think honestly, I'm really excited about that. Like, that's why I like, that's why I like Substance so much, because I set up something in the beginning and I have 10 rows of bricks, but I do all the stuff after that's cool, but I can go back and be like, I want 24, I want 8. That's the same thing.
Yeah, we're artists. We want to tell stories. We want to make good compositions. If the procedural stuff can make our job easier to get to that point, hallelujah.
Yeah,
I agree.
Cool, thank you.
Okay, and our last question is going to come from one of our live stream viewers, Liam. He's asked, how do you know when you've put too much detail into a scene, and how do you avoid that?
It's a great question.
When it's noisy, busy, can't tell what's going on. There's no sense of focus. So if you can't tell where to go or what to look at, that's when it's, in my opinion.
I think that the delete key is as important as any kind of click. And, and I just remember always directing, we got to hit the delete key, I mean, it's funny. It can be as eye rest is something that you mentioned, Josh. I use that term all the time.
Oh, yeah.
You have to give a rhythm where the player doesn't have to be overwhelmed, and they can just let their eye rest. So when a thing is important, you can put the attention to detail there.
Yeah, you mentioned rhythm, and that's kind of a thing that I mentioned quite a bit here and there with people. It's like music. You have to have a flow. If you don't have that flow, you're just breaking the concentration of people.
For me, I hate to answer the question this way because it really maybe doesn't help, but it's a feeling I get. Like, if I look at that and I can't focus, that's distracting, but it's also like, I don't know, there's just like a twinge inside of me that I know this is settled, this is done. So, yeah, I think there's beauty in restraint is what I'll say. Like, it doesn't need to be overdeveloped, it doesn't need to be over-detailed for it to have the essence of what it needs to be.
Emptiness can tell stories, right?
Yeah.
Thank you so much. Well, it's pretty much 4 p.m. now, so you guys have been busy today. Did we have one last question?
There was a question, yeah.
Yeah, okay, we'll take that last one. Sorry. Was it this one?
I just had a question in terms of when you guys were establishing important landmarks in a level, especially with one like the SOS tower that you mentioned from the Tomb Raider thing.
Yeah.
When it's far off in the distance versus when you're right up to it, do you guys have separate models that are different resolution for like in terms of rendering speed and everything?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, sometimes they won't even match exactly. I mean, you try to make it match. But the idea is you have to have different levels of detail, and I think in Tomb Raider that distant thing was just a diffuse map on like, it probably was like 50 polygons total, if not less. It could have just been a billboard.
I think it was a billboard.
I think it was.
Yeah.
Truth comes out.
And that's it, right? Awesome. Let's have a huge round of applause.